For decades, Barbara Mandrell stayed silent. No interviews, no statements, no late-night talk show confessions, just silence. And in the music industry, silence often speaks louder than any headline. But at 76, Barbara is finally ready to break that silence. Not to stir up drama, not to relive the past, but to share the truth about one of the most complicated friendships in country music. Her connection to George Jones was never about romance or scandal. It was something deeper, something the cameras never caught. It all started on a stormy night in 1974, a night that would quietly shape the rest of her life. Back then, Barbara was still climbing her way to the top. She was young, polished, and fiercely professional. Nashville saw her as the perfect face for the future of country music. Reliable, respectful, and safe. But behind that calm surface was a woman who noticed everything. The way the spotlight both lifted and burned. The way fame could turn even the strongest into strangers to themselves. And then there was George Jones, already a legend, already a mystery. His voice could make a crowd fall silent, but his life was anything but steady. Missed shows, lost chances, whispered stories that spread through every tour bus and backstage hallway. By the early 70s, George had become both adored and pitied, the genius who couldn't outrun his own shadow. When their paths crossed, few expected anything meaningful to come from it. He was the cautionary tale, she was the rising star. But that night in Tennessee, fate decided to write a story no one could predict. One that wouldn't make headlines, but would live quietly in Barbara's heart for nearly half a century. Because sometimes, the most powerful stories don't start with a spotlight. They start in the dark, with a voice, a storm, and a single moment that changes everything. And that's where this story begins. The rain had been falling all day, thick, relentless, like the sky itself was trying to drown the music out. The small Tennessee venue was packed anyway, filled with fans waiting for George Jones to take the stage. His name alone could fill a room. But that night, the storm wasn't the only thing unraveling. Backstage, Barbara Mandrell watched quietly. She wasn't the headliner, not yet, but she was the one everyone could count on. The type of artist who never missed a cue, never cracked under pressure. When word spread that George wasn't in any shape to perform, the mood backstage turned heavy. Whispers, worried glances, quick decisions, no one quite sure what to do next. Then, right as the crowd began to grow restless, the lights went out. Total darkness. The power had been knocked out by the storm. All sound stopped except the pounding rain against the roof. For a moment, no one moved. And that's when Barbara made a decision that would follow her for the rest of her life. Without waiting for permission, she picked up her guitar and walked straight onto that pitch-black stage. No spotlight, no microphone, just her voice and 6 strings cutting through the noise. The crowd, loud and impatient seconds before, went silent. Even in the dark, her voice filled the room with calm. It wasn't rehearsed, it wasn't perfect, it was real. From the shadows at the side of the stage, George watched. No jokes, no swagger, just quiet. No one knows what ran through his mind at that moment. But everyone who was there remembers the shift. When the lights finally flickered back to life, the energy in the room was different. The chaos was gone. Barbara had steadied the storm. After the show, when the crew was packing up, George walked over. His words were simple. "You didn't have to do that." Barbara looked up and said, "I know, but I wanted to." That was all. No dramatic music, no teary scene, just 2 people sharing a small, honest moment in the middle of a messy night. But that single exchange would leave an imprint neither of them could fully explain. Because sometimes the quietest moments are the ones that last longest. And for George, that night wasn't just about a song in the dark. It was about being seen, maybe for the first time in a long time. And though no one realized it then, that night was only the beginning. In the years that followed, country music began to change. And so did Barbara Mandrell. By the late 1970s, she wasn't just promising talent anymore. She was a headliner, a powerhouse performer who could sing, play, and entertain with the best of them. Nashville adored her professionalism. She was the artist record labels could trust, talented, controlled, and dependable. But success in country music wasn't simple, especially for a woman. Every outfit, every lyric, every word in an interview was scrutinized. Barbara knew that one wrong move could undo everything she had built. The industry loved its female stars, as long as they stayed perfect. George Jones, meanwhile, was living the opposite side of that coin. His voice still carried the same pain and truth that made him a legend, but his personal life had become a public spectacle. Missed shows, canceled tours, stories of chaos and heartbreak, they followed him everywhere. He was still beloved, but fans never knew which George they were going to get, the master on stage or the ghost backstage. When Barbara and George crossed paths, people warned her, "Keep your distance," they said. "He's trouble." But she never listened to gossip. She understood the weight of being talked about, the sting of judgment. Maybe that's why she didn't turn away. Barbara didn't see George as a risk. She saw him as a person. A man who carried more hurt than most people could see. When they shared the same stages or award nights, she treated him with quiet respect. Not pity, not fear, just understanding. And George noticed. Around Barbara, his guard softened. He didn't try to impress her or hide behind jokes. He was just himself. It was rare for him to find someone who didn't want something. Not a collaboration, not publicity, not a story, just peace. And Barbara gave him that. Their connection wasn't loud or public. It wasn't even obvious to those around them. But it grew quietly, a shared respect between two artists who had both learned what fame could take away. And years later, when a mysterious letter arrived at Barbara's dressing room door, unsigned, heartfelt, and full of truths no one else could have written, she'd realize just how much that one night in Tennessee had meant to him. Because sometimes, the smallest act of kindness can echo louder than 1,000 songs. That letter arrived without warning. No name, no return address. Just a plain white envelope slipped under Barbara's dressing room door after a show in Nashville. At first, she thought it was just another fan note. She received hundreds of them every month, words of love, admiration, sometimes requests for help. But this one was different. The handwriting wasn't neat or planned. It looked rushed, almost desperate, like the person who wrote it couldn't wait another second to get it out. The letter began simply, "You probably won't remember what you did that night, but I do." Immediately, she knew there was only one night that could mean the storm, the blackout, the moment she walked onto that stage and sang without lights. As she read, her heart sank and lifted all at once. The writer spoke about being at the lowest point in his life, feeling invisible, forgotten by the world. He wrote that when she started singing in the dark, it was like someone had reached into the chaos and pulled him back to life. And then, at the bottom, one final line. "Thank you for seeing me when I couldn't see myself." No signature, just silence. Barbara folded the letter and sat there for a long time. She didn't cry, she didn't even smile. She just felt something shift inside her. Because even without a name, she knew exactly who it was from. It wasn't just the words, it was the timing. George had recently missed another tour date, and rumors were swirling again. The industry was harsh, and so were the headlines. She'd seen the exhaustion in his eyes the last time they spoke backstage. The weight of being a man people loved for his pain but judged for his struggle. This letter wasn't an apology. It wasn't even a confession. It was something much deeper. A rare glimpse of George Jones, unfiltered, vulnerable, and real. Barbara never told anyone about the letter. Not her band, not her friends, not even her husband. She tucked it inside a worn leather Bible she carried on the road. To her, it wasn't a memento. It was a reminder. A reminder that compassion, even in small doses, mattered. That the simplest act, walking on stage when the lights went out, could ripple through someone's life in ways no one could predict. Over the years, she would occasionally open that Bible and reread the letter. The paper had yellowed, the ink had faded a little, but the feeling never did. It reminded her that behind every broken headline or tabloid story was a human being trying to hold on. And deep down, Barbara always knew, even if George never said it out loud, that night had connected them in a way no duet or award ever could. But their paths weren't done crossing. Fate had one more twist in store, one that would test the quiet bond they'd built in ways neither of them could have imagined. After that letter, Barbara and George's connection became something unspoken, invisible to the public eye, yet deeply present whenever they shared a room. In an industry built on appearances, their friendship existed in the shadows, away from the cameras and interviews. They didn't call each other often, didn't write duets or make grand gestures. But whenever they did meet, at award shows, charity galas, or backstage at the Opry, there was always a look, a nod, a quiet understanding that didn't need words. Barbara had a way of grounding him. She didn't scold him or try to fix him. She simply treated him like George, not George Jones, the legend. And maybe that's what he needed most, to be reminded that he was still human beneath the myth. She would often recall one moment years later, a private rehearsal for a benefit show. George had been asked to perform, but hadn't shown up for rehearsal. At the last minute, just as the crew was about to wrap up, he walked in, tired, pale, but present. Barbara didn't say a word. She just started playing, slowly, softly, one of his own songs. At first, he stood there, frozen. Then he started to hum along, his voice low and shaky, like he wasn't sure he remembered the words. But within seconds, the old George returned. That voice, the one that could silence a room, came roaring back. When the song ended, he looked at her and simply said, "You always know when to pull me back." She smiled, replying, "You never really leave. You just forget where you are sometimes." That was the essence of their bond. Not romance, not drama, but mutual respect, built on understanding what it meant to survive in a world that loved to watch you fall. Barbara had seen how fame could destroy people from the inside out, and George, he lived it. Every time the headlines called him a troubled legend, she saw the man behind the words, tired, searching, and misunderstood. They weren't close in the usual sense. They didn't vacation together, didn't share personal secrets. But whenever George struggled, Barbara would find a quiet way to check in. A message through a mutual friend, a handwritten note slipped to his team, or a small reminder that someone out there still believed in him. And that meant more to George than the world ever knew. Years later, when he spoke about the people who stood by him through the chaos, he rarely mentioned names. But once during a radio interview, he paused and said softly, "There's one woman in this business who never turned her back on me. She knows who she is." Barbara heard it. She didn't say a word, but she knew. Because some friendships don't need to be defined. They just exist quietly, beautifully, beyond the noise of fame. And yet, as both of them got older, time began to change everything. Fame faded, voices grew softer, and the spotlight moved on. But that bond, that small thread connecting two souls who had seen too much, would come back to the surface one final time, in a way that would break her silence forever. It was a quiet afternoon when the call came, the kind of still day that feels too calm, as if the world itself is holding its breath. Barbara was at home, away from the stage lights, tending her garden when the phone rang. The voice on the other end was soft, hesitant, carrying that tone you recognize instantly, the tone people use when they don't know how to say what's coming next. George Jones was gone. For a long moment, Barbara didn't move. She just stood there, the sunlight flickering across her hands as the wind rustled through the leaves. The world around her went on. Birds, traffic, the hum of life. But inside, something stopped. It wasn't shock. It was something heavier, the quiet ache of finality. She knew he had been struggling with his health, knew that time had been catching up, but knowing never makes it easier. As the words sank in, her mind drifted back, to the letter, to the storm, to that night when the lights went out and she had sung into the darkness. She remembered his face in the shadows, the quiet nod between them, the understanding that didn't need to be spoken. Now, that silence had become permanent. Barbara sat alone for a long time that day, the phone still in her lap. She didn't cry immediately. Instead, she replayed every small memory. His laugh, the way he'd fumble for the right words when he wanted to say something kind, the rare moments when his guard dropped completely. Later that evening, she turned on the television. Every channel was running tributes, old concert clips, interviews, and photos of a young George with that unmistakable smile. The world mourned the legend. But Barbara wasn't mourning the legend. She was mourning the man no one really saw. Reporters called her for comments, for statements, for memories. She declined them all. How could she explain something so quiet, so personal, in a world that wanted headlines and sound bites? Instead, she found herself walking into her study, reaching for that worn Bible and unfolding the letter again. The paper trembled slightly in her hands. The ink was faded now, but the words still carried the same weight. "Thank you for seeing me when I couldn't see myself." She read that line over and over until the tears finally came. Not dramatic sobs, not the kind of crying that makes noise, just the quiet release of years of silence. Because in that moment, she realized something. George's passing hadn't ended their connection. It had completed it. Their story had always been about understanding, not words. About compassion, not fame. And even in death, that truth still lingered. The world was now celebrating a legend. Barbara, though, was saying goodbye to a friend who had once written her a letter that changed everything, and who had unknowingly given her the courage to speak one day. And that day would come sooner than anyone expected. After George's funeral, Barbara withdrew from public life even more. She attended the memorial quietly, slipping in through a side entrance, dressed simply, avoiding cameras. She didn't want attention. She wanted closure. As the preacher spoke about George's legacy, the music, the awards, the influence, Barbara's mind wasn't on his career. It was on the man behind it all, the one who had struggled, fallen, risen again, and somehow kept singing through it all. After the service, she stayed behind. When the crowd had left and the cameras were gone, she walked up to the front of the chapel and placed a single folded note by the flowers. No signature, no explanation. Just a few words she had written herself. "You'll never be forgotten, not for who you were on stage, but for who you were when no one was watching." Then she turned and walked away. In the months that followed, she stayed quiet. No interviews, no statements. Fans wondered why she hadn't spoken out more about George. Journalists speculated that there might have been tension or distance between them. But the truth was simpler and far more powerful. Her silence wasn't avoidance. It was respect. She had seen too many people turn grief into publicity, too many stories twisted into drama. That wasn't who Barbara was, and it wasn't what George would have wanted. Instead, she let her actions speak. When she performed again months later, she chose one of his songs, softly, without introduction, just music, no commentary. The crowd recognized it instantly. A hush fell over the room. It wasn't just a tribute. It was her way of saying, "I remember." And from that moment, something changed in Barbara. She began to reflect more openly on her own journey. The highs, the burnout, the price of being perfect for so long. For the first time, she admitted in interviews that fame had left her tired, even lonely. But whenever George's name came up, her tone softened. She never revealed details, never told the full story of the letter or the night in the dark, but her eyes said what words never could. In one rare interview, when asked why she thought George's voice touched so many hearts, she paused and said quietly, "Because he sang like a man who'd been forgiven." That line said everything. For Barbara, the bond they shared was never about the spotlight or the stage. It was about two people who had survived the same storm, one publicly, one privately, and who had somehow found light in each other's darkness. And though she never planned to reveal the full story, the silence itself became her message. Because sometimes, what you don't say speaks the loudest. But years later, when a rare recording surfaced, an old rehearsal tape capturing a private duet no one had ever heard, that silence would finally break, and the world would hear the truth hidden behind decades of quiet loyalty. When word of the tape first reached Barbara, she didn't believe it. Over the years, she'd heard all kinds of claims, fake demos, edited recordings, rare duets that never happened. But when the studio sent her a digital copy, and she pressed play, everything stopped. It began with static, the faint hum of an old microphone warming up. Then came George's unmistakable voice, low and rough, singing the opening lines of a song that no one recognized. Seconds later, another voice joined in, soft, clear, steady, hers. Barbara hadn't even remembered recording it. But as she listened, the memories began to return. It must have been sometime around 1980, during a private rehearsal for a benefit event. George had been there unexpectedly, and between practice takes, someone, maybe a sound tech, had hit record without telling them. The song itself was simple, a slow, heartfelt piece about holding on through storms and finding light in broken places. Their voices blended in a way that was hauntingly beautiful. Imperfect, raw, real. But what made the tape so powerful wasn't the song itself. It was what came after. The music faded, and the tape kept rolling. You could hear laughter. George joking, saying, "You always clean up my mess, Barbara." And her soft reply, "Some messes are worth cleaning." Then, a pause. Silence. And finally, George's voice again, quieter this time. "If they ever tell my story, make sure they remember the good parts too." That line hit her like a weight, because that's exactly what she had done, carried his memory quietly, protecting the good, shielding the rest. For years, Barbara had refused to talk about George in detail. She didn't want to feed the rumors, didn't want to add to the noise. But when this recording surfaced, she realized something. Their truth was already there, hidden in that song, waiting to be heard. So when journalists called this time, she didn't hang up. Instead, she agreed to speak, not for publicity, not for headlines, but because she finally understood what George meant that day on the tape. In an emotional interview, she revealed that song wasn't meant for anyone to hear, but maybe it was meant to remind people who George really was, a man with a heart bigger than his pain. For the first time in decades, Barbara talked about their friendship, about the letter, about the night of the blackout, about what compassion meant in a world that thrived on judgment. She didn't reveal everything, but she said enough to let people see the truth. That kindness had quietly connected them far beyond the fame or the chaos. And when the recording was finally released, digitally remastered and shared online, it wasn't a hit single. It was something purer. Fans described it as a ghost reaching out, a goodbye wrapped in harmony, the sound of forgiveness. For Barbara, it was closure. The world finally heard the part of George Jones she had always known. And with that, the silence she had carried for decades finally broke. In the years after that recording was released, Barbara didn't return to the spotlight. She didn't need to. She had said what needed saying, not through speeches or interviews, but through something more honest, truth in sound. The duet became more than just a song. It became a message about compassion, loyalty, and the parts of people we often fail to see. For younger artists in Nashville, it was a lesson in grace, that fame may fade, but humanity endures. Barbara was asked countless times why she had waited so long to speak. Her answer was always the same: because some stories aren't ready until they've had time to breathe. That silence, once seen as distance or mystery, was really her way of protecting something sacred. In an age where every secret is sold and every emotion becomes a headline, Barbara Mandrell had chosen to guard the things that mattered most: dignity, memory, and truth. She often said that George's greatest strength wasn't his voice, but his vulnerability. He sang about pain because he lived it. And she believed that people like him, people who feel everything too deeply, leave a mark that time can't erase. When asked about her own legacy, she smiled and said softly, "I think I'd like to be remembered for listening, for knowing when not to talk, That was Barbara's way: quiet, steady, real. She had spent her life in an industry where silence was often mistaken for weakness, but in the end, it became her greatest act of strength. The story of Barbara Mandrell and George Jones isn't a love story, nor is it a tragedy. It's something rarer, a story about grace between two people who understood the price of fame and the power of forgiveness. And even today, when that secret song plays, the one recorded in a forgotten room decades ago, listeners say you can feel it. The shared understanding, the unspoken tenderness, the sound of two souls finding peace. Barbara once said that every person in music leaves behind a note, not a literal one, but a vibration that lingers long after they're gone. For George, it was his voice. For Barbara, it was her silence. And together, they created something that still echoes, proof that even in an industry obsessed with noise, sometimes the quietest truths sing the loudest.